Jonathon Porritt, thank you for coming. You were a teacher at the start of the 1980s. How did you get into the environment movement? What was going on at that point?
So I'd been very involved in the Ecology Party, as it was then called. It didn't change its name to the Green Party till 1986, I think, which is interesting. I'd been involved since 1975, and at the start of the 80s, I was a co-chair. In fact, if I'm being technically correct, I was a rotating co-chair, as the Green Party was not into leadership in those days. So they rotated anybody out of any leadership role as fast as they possibly could. So that was my principal area of engagement with green politics and with the green movement as a whole. And I must say, it was tough times for green politics, green issues at the start of the 80s. Not a lot.
Because the ideas were just not in the public domain, or because...
They were very immature at that stage. The ideas hadn't really taken root very much. There was obviously large numbers of people who had particular interests about different themes, particularly in the conservation movement rather than the more radical environment movement. But they tended to be in organisations like WWF, or the Council for the Protection of Rural England as it then was, RSPB, big established conservation organisations, but none of the radical edge that we've had since then.
And that's what you brought in, you and others like you. You came in and you radicalised the whole environment movement.
Well, Friends of the Earth, because I went to Friends of the Earth then as director in 1984, and obviously Friends of the Earth had been around for a long time, as had Greenpeace, and had both had very effective campaigns on very specific issues up until then. But there wasn't any sense of a mass movement. There wasn't any sense of large numbers of people getting behind those organisations. 80s changed that. There was a dual focus, partly on domestic issues, still to do with things like land use. The Wildlife and Countryside Act was a big deal running for 2 or 3 years, but also a big emphasis on global issues. Acid rain, which we don't hear anything about these days, was a huge concern through the 1980s. Anti-nuclear campaigning, which we thought had gone away, but obviously not. First rainforest campaigns got going, and a very big campaign about ozone depletion and getting rid of all the gases that were causing the thinning of the ozone layer.
But were you getting a big new sense of a civil society waking up to these issues? Were there people knocking on the door saying, I want to join the Friends of the Earth? I mean, this was a time of great growth of these ideas.
Yes, I mean, looking at the membership figures for the green organisations through the 1980s, it was pretty static, frankly, until about 1986. And then things did begin to pick up quite a lot. I think people were starting to get much more worried about some of these issues. The media coverage began to pick up a bit. But one of the things that environmentalists have a little bit of difficulty in acknowledging is that it wasn't until Mrs. Thatcher went into her short-lived green period that suddenly things really took off. So from 87, 88, when Mrs. Thatcher started to talk about the ozone layer, climate change, big issues like that, I think a lot of people who'd said, these green issues, they're just for the tree-hugging weirdos, suddenly thought, cool, there's Mrs. Thatcher saying that. There's got to be something in it.
Are you saying that Mrs. Thatcher was actually largely responsible for the green movement taking off?
No, but she definitely played a big part in it by making it more acceptable to a much larger number of people. And I remember watching the Friends of the Earth membership figures, which were growing extremely fast at that time. And the whole profile of membership changed in Friends of the Earth at that time. People who wouldn't have thought of joining the organisation decided that it was okay to join the organisation, and it gave voice to a very critical part of their own belief system at that time.
But you had quite a lot of establishment backing. I mean, the people like Sir Crispin Tickell, ambassador for Britain. I mean, he was pushing Margaret Thatcher and others. I mean, you had a lot of support from within the old conservation movement, or was this was new science?
I don't remember that coming from the old conservation movement, I must admit. In fact, I've got a suspicion that a lot of the more radical ideas from the green movement in the mid-80s weren't that welcome to the more traditional conservation organisations, not least because of the emphasis we put on the people side of this. I mean, Friends of the Earth at that time was campaigning a lot about things like jobs, about human rights, about access to opportunity, about environmental justice. This had never been on the agenda of any of the big groups.
You were a very young movement. I mean, was students, these were people in the early 20s, or did this actually cross over a huge range of British organisations?
I think that from the middle of the 80s onwards, the profile became predominantly younger. It was more radical, there's no question about that. The big international campaigns got people thinking much more about their role as citizens of planet Earth rather than inhabitants of Basingstoke or Bognor Regis or whatever it might be. And there was a sense that this was something that had to be responded to with much greater urgency. So some of that apocalyptic tone came into the movement in the 1980s, early signals about climate change in particular towards the end of the decade.
Did you see yourself as part of a new civil society with a new remit to question and interrogate government?
In a narrow way. I don't actually recall big debates about where we fitted in terms of social movements, where we fitted in terms of civil society. None of that kind of attempt to position green ideas as part of a much broader flux of ideas. There was a big red-green debate going on. Lots of people in the socialist world and the labour movement were very concerned to get a better fit between the green ideas and socialist ideas. And of course the Lib Dems saw themselves as the holders of the green flame, if you like. A bit sad it's been snuffed out so comprehensively now in the 21st century, but there we go. At that time, of all the mainstream parties, the Lib Dems were doing the best job. And the Green Party struggled to make headway against some of those mainstream party positions.
How did government see you? Were you just the pesky mosquitoes who were sort of nipping them?
Oh yes, no, the Green movement in those days was characterised appropriately, I think, by Mrs. Thatcher as the enemy within. And there was a sense that the campaigns that we brought to bear had a double focus. One focus was on the issue itself, and then if you listen to the more paranoid voices in the Conservative Party at that time, we apparently had a second purpose, which was to bring down society.
This was the Nicholas Ridleys.
The Nicholas Ridleys of this world. And it was fairly extraordinary, to be honest, when you heard them in full flow. I don't think it did us any harm. Nicholas Ridley was one of the best recruiting sergeants for the Green movement we ever had.
Jonathon Porritt, thank you very much indeed.